Hello everybody, just trying to test out the technology. Apologise for the delay. Hello, I think this is working for me now. I'm just trying to get myself all organised. So this is my first time ever using Facebook Live, so if everyone just wants to bear with me for a moment while I make sure that everything is up and working. I'm just seeing some, checking out what's happening. But Nyata, hello. My name is Rueben Berg. I am a Gunjamara man. My family comes from Framlingham, and I'm very excited to be doing this live Facebook chat with everybody. As I said, this is my first time doing this, so I apologise for the delay at the start there, and hopefully everyone can just bear with me as I get used to this technology. But Gunjamara man, and as a Gunjamara man, it's always really important for me to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm meeting, because I don't live on Gunjamara land, and I live here on the lands of both the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people, so I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to acknowledge the traditional owners all across here in Victoria. Really glad that people could join me here today on the Facebook Live, and I was hoping to be able to do this sort of a conversation in person with people and have a bit of a conversation around what's been going on. But in light of all the things that are happening in our communities at the moment with COVID-19, that's not possible. So that's why I'm here today on Facebook. And I do hope that everyone is doing okay during these trying times. It is a challenge, and I know it can be more of a challenge for some than for others. So really hoping that everyone is doing okay and that we can stay safe, and hopefully things can can improve in the not too distant future. My aim here today is to try and give you all a bit of an overview about what's actually been happening with the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, and what's been happening since it formed. And there's been this is not just about what's happening with treaty, because there's been a whole lot of stuff that's happened around treaty for quite some time. The First Peoples Assembly of Victoria is just one phase of that, and it won't be the end of that either. There's going to be a lot of stuff happening beyond the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, and I always like to acknowledge that there has been a lot of amazing work done by many people over the years to get us even to this point here today. But so I'm hoping to just give you a bit of an oversight of what has happened so far for the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, and also to give you some of my views and perspectives on some of the key things that we're trying to discuss, and then hopefully to be able to answer some questions that people might have. And I'm just trying to make sure that I've got my feed all up and running so I can see questions if they come through. As I said, I'm very new to using this Facebook Live, so I apologise if there are some delays, or if there's some technical difficulties or just human difficulties for myself trying to work out how this all operates. And hopefully people are able to make comments and ask questions below as we go. And I can see some, thank you Damien Bell, saying yep down there, so I assume that means that things are working, and people can send me a message there if things aren't doing so well either, and hopefully I can try and smooth that out. First up though, I thought I'd probably share a bit more about myself, because not everyone who's following along might know everything about who I am, and primarily I guess I always love sharing about my family. Family is a really important thing to me, and so I live here in Ashwood with my partner Tegan and our two amazing kids. So we've got my son, whose name is Kalinga, who's 6.5, and also got our daughter Jira, who is 2.5. And so my family that's here is probably it's one of the most important things, my family. And so that's a really key part of who I am. In terms of the work that I do, I've got my own business where I run my own consulting work. And through that, I run training around cultural awareness. I run training around cultural heritage management. I do work specifically with Indigenous community around getting them to learn more about what it's like to work for government. So I'm involved in the WEX program, which brings year 11 and 12 kids from all over the country together to come and learn about the government and what that's like. And also do some work for Right People for Country. So I work with traditional owners to try and help them resolve their boundary disputes. And so that's one of the other key roles I play in that space. I also have a variety of different government appointments I've been able to secure over the years. One of those is down at Western Port Water. So I'm a director and the deputy chair down at Western Port Water, which is the water authority around Phillip Island. And so they look after the drinking water and the sewage down there at Phillip Island. So I've been on that board since 2015. I'm also a commissioner for the Victorian Environmental Water Holder, which looks after the water for the environment across the state. In addition to that, I'm a member of the Heritage Council of Victoria. And so that's not the Aboriginal Heritage Council. I'm talking about the non-Aboriginal Heritage Council. And so they look after non-Aboriginal heritage across the state. So I'm on that council there. And also, for those who know me, will know quite well that I'm quite obsessed with ultimate frisbee. And so one of the other roles I have is as the chair of the World Flying Disc Federation Ultimate Rules Subcommittee. So looking at the rules of the sport of ultimate frisbee around the world, which was another one of my great passions. And if anyone wants to ever ask me about that, feel free and we'll have a separate conversation around that. But more importantly to today's conversations, I'm also a member and a director of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. And the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria is a public company. So it's not a government department. It's not registered under ORIC. It was chosen to be registered as a public company to give it the most independence as possible from government. And so that's what I'm a part of, a member of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. And we have a constitution that governs what we do as the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. And you can find a copy of our constitution on the website for the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. If you just Google First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, you'll find our website there. And that constitution spells out what we're supposed to be doing. What is the purpose of this organisation, the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria? And I just thought I'd highlight for people just some of those key objectives that we've got, just to give a clearer picture of what the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria is all about. One of the things we're supposed to do is advance the treaty process with Aboriginal Victorians. Another thing is to act as the Aboriginal representative body, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment. Another of the things we're trying to do is enabling traditional owners and Aboriginal Victorians to exercise sovereignty, enabling traditional owners and Aboriginal Victorians to exercise their right to self-determination, enabling an exercise of rights, including those contained in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So that document, which is a really important document, and those who haven't looked at that in much detail before, I really encourage you to go and take a look at that United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's enshrined as one of the things we need to be mindful of within the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. And we also, as part of that, we should be working with governments to establish or be a First Nations voice to government or parliament. So those are the kind of objectives set out in our constitution, which gives you, I guess, hopefully some of the flavour of what we're trying to do. And also within that constitution, you'll see that we've got some guiding values. And that's a really important thing, to have some of those guiding values. And I'll just give you a flavour of that as well. It says that in pursuing its objectives, the Assembly will be guided by the following: traditional laws, law and legal tradition, cultural values and practices, respect and equality, respect for elders past, present and emerging, and participation of young people. So those are some pretty key things that we're supposed to be guided by as the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. And I think so far in what we've been doing, I'm hopeful that we can say that we've been following in those things, and we'll continue to try and follow in those things as we move forward. I'm just constantly trying to just check my messages and check to see if there's any concerns that people have. If you do have things that aren't working, please let me know, and I will try and see what I can do to help you out and fix things up as we go through there. So that's what the objectives are of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. and that's also what some of our guiding values are. And I mentioned earlier this idea of the Aboriginal representative body, and that's what we have been identified as under the Advancing the Treaty process with Aboriginal Victorians 2018. That was a specific act of the Victorian Parliament to have this Advancing the Treaty Process Act, and under that act it identified that there needed to be an Aboriginal representative body that the state would negotiate with around treaty, and the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria has been recognised as that Aboriginal representative body. And so that's how we kind of come to be the entity that's responsible for treaty here in Victoria, along with the state. It's a really interesting piece of legislation. So if you actually go and have a look at the piece of legislation, there's quite a lengthy preamble at the start. And it is a really powerful thing to be able to have a look at, because it really, I think, sets the tone about the treaty process. And because it's a piece of legislation, it's something the government has endorsed, and the government has said, this is what we're trying to do, and this is how we want to go about it. So I think it is a really critical touchstone for thinking about treaty. And I thought I'd just highlight some key elements of that preamble for people here today as well. Okay, I'm just checking in to make sure that there's no other comments. Looks like we've got at least a few people watching online. And again, I really appreciate those who have joined in online to watch my first attempt here at a Facebook Live conversation. So some key elements of that act, that Advancing the Treaty Process Act, the preamble, and it's talking about the relationship between Aboriginal Victorians and the state. And it says that through this act, all Aboriginal Victorians and the state are building on this relationship and other good work on embarking on a renewed and mature relationship. That's what this preamble talks about. And it says that it needs to be a relationship of equal partnership, founded on mutual respect and a commitment to justice and equality for Aboriginal Victorians. And so I think that emphasis there of the justice and equality is quite a powerful thing to have highlighted in that act. It also then goes on to talk about what a treaty might be about. And it says that the contents of a future treaty or treaties are yet unknown. And that's true, we don't know what a treaty could be. In this document, this act doesn't say what it has to be. But it does say that a future treaty or treaties can help to heal the wounds of the past, provide recognition for historic wrongs, address ongoing injustices, support reconciliation and promote the fundamental human rights of Aboriginal peoples, including the right to self-determination, which I think is, again, some really powerful elements identified that are the possibilities within that pieces of legislation. And then it goes on to say at the end of the preamble that the injustices of the past cannot be undone. The state is pursuing treaty because it is the right thing to do. Victoria needs a treaty or treaties that are reciprocal and that through truth and justice provide far-reaching benefits for Aboriginal Victorians. And so this is the guiding document that is overarching for what's happening with treaty. And I think, as you can hear there are some really powerful elements to that around this sense of truth and justice. And I know that's a thing that lots of people talk about in the community, and to see it embedded in a piece of legislation, I think gives us hope that that's something the government's open to and that we can continue down that path. The Act also sets out some guiding principles for the treaty process, and those are self-determination and empowerment, fairness and equality, partnership and good faith, mutual benefit and sustainability, and transparency and accountability. So those are some of the principles, and it spells out in more detail exactly what it means by some of those principles. But I think that's a good base, I think, for us to start having these relationships with government through this treaty process along those principles. The piece of legislation also sets out what we actually have to do as the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. And it really identifies three key elements of what the First Peoples Assembly must do in partnership with the state, or in agreement with the state. And that's established three things. The first of which is the treaty authority. And that's kind of like the umpire in the treaty process. That's kind of looking at if there is a dispute between the state, between those who are negotiating treaty, how do you resolve that? What are the ways of going about that? What are the agreed ways we can go about that? And that's what the treaty authority is, and that's what needs to be established. We also need to establish a treaty negotiating framework. And so that sets out what is the treaty all about, how we're going to enter into treaties, who are they with, what is in a treaty. That's what the treaty negotiating framework is about. And the last one, the thing that we need to do is establish a self-determination fund. And that's looking at how are we funding this process, how are we supporting traditional owners through this process, and how can we do that in a way that's independent of government. So those are the overarching key things that the Act says we must do. And it also talks about the various details around that, and it deals with some other things around how to resolve disputes in a broader sense. So that hopefully gives you a broad sense around what the legislation says and around what the First Peoples Assembly is trying to do and is required to do under the Act that governs us. And as been, there was a question, a comment there around, it's around negotiating the framework for a treaty. It is not that we are negotiating treaties, and I think that's something to be really clear and make sure everyone understands, is that there needs to be a treaty. This process is about establishing the framework. It's never been the role, and it isn't planned to be the role, it's not going to be the role of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria to negotiate treaties on behalf of traditional owners. That's not the role of the Assembly. The role is to establish the framework for that treaty, and that's a really important thing to understand. But who are actually the Assembly? So the Assembly is an elected body. There was an election held last year, and that election was ended in November. Results were decided in November 2019. And from that, there were 21 people who were elected as part of that election process. 9 from the metropolitan region, and then there were 4 other regions across the state, and there were 3 representatives from each of those regions. And in terms of who could run in those places and where people would run, you could choose to either run where you lived, which is what I chose to do. I live in Melbourne, and so I ran in the Melbourne electorate. Or you could choose to be nominated or represent the area where you're from as a traditional owner. And so you had those 2 choices. As well as the 21 elected representatives, there was also 10, there were seats available for representatives from the registered Aboriginal parties. So each registered Aboriginal party in the state was able to nominate 1 representative. And the registered Aboriginal parties is a body that was established under the Aboriginal Heritage Act. And so they are groups that have been appointed by the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council, primarily around cultural heritage management. But in recognising them, they've been identified as the appropriate traditional owners to talk for a particular place. And so those groups were all given a spot, and they had to use their own internal processes to decide who was going to be the representative. And not all the RAPs nominated a representative. Yorta Yorta as yet don't have a representative on the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. But the other 10 RAPs did, and so that gives us our 21 elected from the broad community and the 10 representatives of the registered Aboriginal parties, forming the 31-member Assembly. And so far as an Assembly, we've had 2 meetings. 2 meetings as the entire Assembly, as all 31 of us. And the first one was at Parliament House in December, which some of you may have seen that, and that was quite a momentous occasion to be a part of. It was really quite just an inspiring thing to be a part of. And you can find the speeches from that. Everyone gave their maiden speech and talked about why they were part of this process, and that was really wonderful. And you can find copies of those online. You can find everybody's speech at the website for the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. And we also had a chance to hear from the Premier and from Gavin Jennings, who was the Minister at the time for Aboriginal Affairs. He has since moved on from that role and from Parliament. And the new Minister is Gabrielle Williams. The Premier, it was quite powerful hearing the Premier speak, and to me it was really clear the level of commitment he had to this process. And you can go and find his speech on YouTube, and I'll try and share that in the not too distant future as well, so people can have a look at that. The other key thing that happened on that first meeting was we actually elected our board and we elected our co-chairs. And so we had Geraldine Atkinson elected as one of the co-chairs and Marcus Stewart as the other co-chair. I was also then lucky enough to be elected to the board alongside Tracy Evans, Melissa Jones, Jamie Lowe, Troy McDonald, Nagara Murray and Trent Nelson. And so the board of the First People's Assembly, we meet monthly to progress the work of the First People's Assembly of Victoria as a company. So we are responsible for the company of the First People's Assembly of Victoria, and we don't make treaty-related decisions. Any decisions around the treaty process, around the framework, around the authority, all that must be made by the whole Assembly. And as I said before, that's not about determining what is, not actually about coming up with a treaty. It's not about negotiating a treaty. It's about the process for treaties. That's the role of the Assembly, and that's not a role the board plays. The board, as I said, is about the operations of the company of the First People's Assembly of Victoria. We then had another meeting in March at the League out in Thornbury, and you can find a communique for that meeting on our website, so you can see in more detail what happened at that meeting. But the main things that happened was we got an update there was provided from the board, got an update from all the members around what was going on in their communities, got an update from the committees, which I'll touch on those in a moment. We heard from representatives from the Melbourne Law School and First Nations Legal, and we also heard from representatives from the British Columbia Treaty Commission. And that was really powerful, hearing some of those perspectives from overseas. And we didn't just hear from representatives from the Treaty Commission, though, as part of our work. In other committees, we've heard from other experts who are not connected to the British Columbia Treaty Commission. And I think that's really important to do because, just like anything and things that many of us are familiar with here in Victoria, not everyone agrees with how things are done. Not everyone agrees with how things operate. And so I think it's important to not just hear from the institutions, but also to hear from other people to see what might be some of the different perspectives so that we can learn from overseas about what went well and what didn't go so well, what some learnings are, and how we can hopefully come up with the best process possible for us here in Victoria. We also then had some updates around our communications and our engagement processes and how we can improve those and how we can hopefully get more of the community involved in what we're doing and hopefully get the community to better understand what we're trying to do. And we got an update from the management of the First People's Assembly of Victoria. And so I think it's important to just give a broad understanding around that there is the Assembly, then there is the board of the Assembly, and there's the co-chairs, but there's also an executive, there's the management, the staff of the First People's Assembly of Victoria, and they're responsible for the day-to-day operations of the company of the First People's Assembly of Victoria. Some of you may have seen we advertised for a CEO, and that recruitment process is still underway. And once there's information to share about that, that will be shared as quickly as possible. But as I said, that process is still underway. Some of the staff from the Victorian Treaty Advancement Commission actually came across and continued working for the First People's Assembly of Victoria. And that commission was previously led by Jill Gallagher. She was the Treaty Commissioner. So she no longer has a role. She transferred that role and what she was doing to the hands of the First People's Assembly of Victoria. And I just want to take this opportunity to thank Jill for the amazing work that she did. I think it's also her birthday today, so a big shout out to Jill and happy birthday to you. The First People's Assembly of Victoria is still looking for new staff. So if you do jump onto our website, you'll see some opportunities there for staff, and there'll be ongoing opportunities as well. So really encourage people to jump on board and see what opportunities might come so you can come and join us at the First People's Assembly of Victoria. I touched earlier around this idea of the committees, and there have been 5 member committees established by the First People's Assembly of Victoria, and they're chaired by board members, and they provide recommendations for the whole Assembly regarding treaty matters. So the committees, again, they don't have authorities to make decisions. They just discuss and they put recommendations up, and it's the whole Assembly, all 31, that will make decisions around treaty-related matters, not negotiating treaties, but around the framework of treaties, of what treaties can look like. So the different committees that we have the Treaty Authority Committee, which is chaired by Nagara Murray, and that's about that umpire, that dispute process, and trying to make sure that if there are disputes that we can resolve those and have a process in place to resolve them before they come up. There's also the Self-Determination Fund Committee, which is chaired by Troy McDonald, and they've got two primary functions around supporting traditional owners and Aboriginal Victorians to negotiate treaties on equal standing with the state, and providing a financial resource independent of the state that empowers traditional owners and Aboriginal Victorians to build capacity, wealth and prosperity. There is also the Treaty Negotiation Framework Committee, which is chaired by Jamie Lowe, and that's looking at who can make a treaty, what treaties should actually look like, what should be in treaties, and it's that framework level, not at individual nation levels that we're talking about what will be a treaty, because that's not the role of the Assembly, but it's about the framework. What is the structure of treaties? So those three committees in particular address those three key things that were spelled out in the legislation. And we've also introduced two other additional committees. One is the Elders' Voice Committee, which is chaired by Tracy Evans. And you can find more about what's been going on with the work around elders. There's the report done prior to the establishment of the Assembly under the Resources tab there. But that's looking at how can we ensure that our elders, who are critically important to our community, have a voice in this process, and that we can ensure that that voice is heard and given the appropriate respect and authority it should have. There's also a Cultural Governance Committee that's been established, and that's chaired by Trent Nelson. And that's looking at how we do our business. And so given that we are a company, and given we got these responsibilities under legislation, there are certain constraints on what we can do, but that committee is trying to look at how can we do it in a way that best reflects our culture, that best reflects the way that we do business. And so that's the role of that committee, to look at how we can do business in the most culturally appropriate way possible. Now, some of that work of those committees has been impacted by COVID-19. And so they haven't been able to meet in person, which is a really important thing to be able to do. It's all been online meeting that we've been able to do. But that work is still continuing, and so there will still be outcomes from those committees. I'm going to now touch to my specific perspectives that I've got around the framework. And I just really want to pause and reflect and note that these are just my views. These aren't the views of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria. They aren't necessarily the views of the board. They aren't necessarily the views of the entire Assembly. These are just my perspectives, and I'm keen to, through this process and after today, to continue to hear from the broader community about what you think about these things and what you think that we should be doing. But I just thought I'd share my views on some key issues, particularly around the framework, but more broadly as well. So one of the questions that some of you might have seen me post about previously was around whether or not there should be one treaty for the state of Victoria and traditional owners, whether there should be multiple treaties just between nations and the state, or whether we should have some hybrid model. And again, that's not whether we should negotiate those things, it's whether that should be the structure. And so there's pros and cons to those different ways of looking at things. If you've got a statewide treaty, that enables you to deal with statewide issues on a really high level. And it also is a much simpler process if you only have one treaty between the government and between Victorian traditional owners. That's only one thing that need to negotiate. But I think it doesn't quite capture what I think many people are after in terms of a treaty, which is about recognising nations, recognising particular groups, and them having their own independent authority, them having their own self-determination. And so the other option of the three is that you could just have groups, you could just have nations, whichever language you want to use. There's lots of different terms that people use in terms of clans, in terms of nations, in terms of various different terminologies used out there. Each of those groups could have their own treaty with the government, and so you could have multiple different treaties in that regard. And I think there's lots of great benefits that come from being able to do that, particularly around how each group wants to do things on their land would be determined through those individual treaties. But I think it lacks the opportunities that come from that overarching treaty as well. So that's why my preference is this kind of hybrid model, where we have one version of a statewide treaty, and then you also have lots of other treaties between the various nations, between the various groups. But I think to really tease that out, to really get an understanding of what that would look like, I think us as the committees and as the First Peoples Assembly are going to have to start kind of teasing out what some of those options really look like. So who would a statewide treaty actually be with? who would the nation treaties be with, and what would be things that sit within a statewide treaty as compared to what would be things that sit within the nation or the group treaties. And so that's one of the things I'm going to be trying to pursue in my role and as part of the committee for the framework, is trying to really tease out what that looks like with various options. Not have to decide which one it is at this stage, but just see what those various options are so that we can hopefully have a more informed decision about which of those three models is the best model to be able to use. And I recognise that the hybrid model is good at ticking lots of boxes in terms of meeting needs, but it is really complicated. And so that's one of the things we're going to have to try and weigh up, that complexity versus trying to meet those interests and those needs. Through that, the other question is going to be around who do we actually have a treaty with? Who should have authority to have a treaty? And so that's what this framework needs to establish. It needs to be able to have a set out which parties are going to be able to sit at the table and negotiate a treaty. And as I said, there's lots of different terminology that gets used around language groups, around clans, around nations. And I think it's great to have various perspectives on that. And I think we're going to have to try and find some way of getting the terminology that we can use that works for as many people as we can. And I think it's also really important to be able to respect the rights of groups to form larger groups, that some groups might want to just stay within their clan system. Some might want to move up into that larger group of a language group, or some language groups might want to form larger nations. And I think there needs to be the flexibility to enable groups to be able to have that conversation and decide themselves about how they want to do that. And if we are then going to work out who's going to sit at the table, I think it's important to stop and reflect on what already exists out there. Because you don't just want to start from scratch necessarily. It might be that you choose to start from scratch, but I think you first off want to start thinking about what's already happening. And so there are various recognised traditional owner groups here in Victoria. One of the mechanisms that a group will get recognised under is through native title. Another way is through the Traditional Owner Settlement Act. And the other way, which we've already talked about today, is through the Registered Aboriginal Party process. And from my understanding of those three different entities, those systems, that the Registered Aboriginal Party system seems to be, of the three, the more approachable one for groups to be able to obtain. That the native title seems a really challenging one to be able to obtain. Traditional Owner Settlement Act is a bar below that, and then the Registered Aboriginal Party status seems to be the more obtainable of them all. And from my perspective, I think that the Registered Aboriginal Party system is a pretty good one. And I recognise that I've got some biases in that. My dad, Jim Berg, he was a part of the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council that appointed registered Aboriginal parties, and he was part of that for quite some time. And I've also worked directly with the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council. I've worked directly with Aboriginal Victoria around those matters through my roles with Right People for Country. But I do see that the Registered Aboriginal Party process is a good one for being able to identify organisations that can represent traditional owners and that have boundaries that are identifiable and that have an understanding between their neighbours about where those boundaries sit. So the starting point for me when I'm looking at who should enter into treaty, to me, from my own personal perspective, I think the RAP is a good starting place to go with. Now, I agree that not all groups have a RAP. If you look at the map of where the RAPs are, it doesn't cover the whole state. So there's still work to be done to ensure that all groups are represented. And that's one of the concerns we have right now with the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, that there's only formal representation by those 10 groups, not by all the groups within the state. And so there is missing within that representatives. And so how do we go about fixing that? How do we go ensure that all nations get a chance of doing that? I'm more inclined to think that we can work with the system we've got for the Registered Aboriginal Party process to come up with identifying those groups, whether that needs some tweaking, whether that needs some adjustment, and what role we can play in that, I'm not sure. And I know that one of the things that I hear concern about is that the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs appoints the members of the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council. So perhaps there's ways of adjusting that to make it something that feels like it's a better representation for our community. But I think that's a really critical thing to think about is, are the Registered Aboriginal Party, is that system going to be the best way to identify nations that can have a treaty? Or do we need to come up with a totally new system that ignores all those? Or do we recognize the existing groups but find a new way to identify groups that haven't been previously accepted? And if we're doing that, though, how is that process different to what the RAP's already doing, the Victorian Aboriginal Heritage Council is already doing? So that's, to me, kind of the puzzle that I don't have a firm opinion on. I'm always keen to hear other people's perspectives on, about how do we get broader representation in a way that is actually representative and that there's not just disputes. Because it's easy, I think, for one person to say, well, I represent these traditional owners. But what process do we need to go through to make sure that they do represent those traditional owners, that other traditional owners agree that they represent them, and that the boundaries between those are clear? And so those are the things that are going to be, on my mind, trying to work out how we move forward. That's around the nation treaties. If we're actually going to have a statewide treaty, who should that actually be with? Who should sit at the table with government to negotiate a statewide treaty? And as I said before, the first People's Assembly of Victoria, that's not our role to sit and negotiate treaties. It is our role to establish the framework of what the form of the treaties are, what the structure of them is, but not the content. And so who should sit at the table to discuss that? Should it be representatives from the existing traditional owner groups? Should it be representatives from the peak organisations out there around health, around justice, around education? Should it be some newly elected group? Should it be a different appointed group? I think that it's really important to have a think about how we would actually put that institution together. And I think there may be opportunities, given that the first People's Assembly of Victoria, the elections for that, so we had our set of elections in 2019, the next set of elections coming in December 23, well, have to occur by that date. They could happen earlier, but they must occur at least by 2023. Perhaps there's an opportunity to reframe what the first People's Assembly of Victoria will do post the elections. I would never suggest that we would change it before the election process, but post the election process, so that the first People's Assembly in that new form could be used as that body to negotiate a statewide treaty. So that's another thing to consider. I think, in my mind, when I'm trying to think about all these things, it's how do we not create unnecessarily duplication? How do we work with what we've got to come up with the best solution? Because I don't think every single time we want to just sit down and start from scratch. I think it's important to be able to draw from the structures that we've already got, but do so in a way that reflects what we're trying to achieve, and also always in a way that does enable the whole community to be represented. So that's one of those big questions around, if we do have a statewide treaty, who's it actually going to be with? Lots of different options. Do you just have representatives from traditional owners and peaks? Do you have a totally newly elected group? Or is there a way of transitioning the first People's Assembly of Victoria to be that group that can negotiate treaties? Those are just some of the options, and as the committee around the framework, we'll continue to discuss those, but always keen to hear other people's perspectives. And as I said, those are just my views on what some of the options might be. The next thing I'm going to move on to, and thanks everybody for staying tuned here and joining me here on the stream, but I'm going to now move to just talk about what could be in a treaty. And this is, again, setting up the framework of what's in treaty. It's not about the details of the treaty, it's about what's on the table and what's not on the table. And these are things that we need to sit down with the government and agree on. What are things that could be in a treaty? And fundamentally, to me, it's got to be about self-determination. It's got to be about how are we empowering traditional owners, how are we empowering Aboriginal Victorians to take control of their own lives, to take control of their own communities. So that government is not just coming out and engaging with us, is not just partnering with us, but we have the lead in the things that affect us. And so as a baseline, I think what we need to be doing is cementing a lot of the good work that's happening at the moment. And I think there is a lot of great work happening between government and Victorian Aboriginal people. And I think a lot of that needs to be cemented within the treaty process and then built upon. I think we can do even further things as part of that. And some of the things that really interest me are around the management of our land and the management of our water. And how can we move to a place where traditional owners who are descendants of people who've been managing that land, managing that water for tens of thousands of years can again be in control of making those decisions. And I think there could be mechanisms through a treaty to enable that to happen, and that's one of the things I'm keen to see as a part of treaty. Other more kind of practical things as well is around what are the opportunities through a treaty process to get place names reinstated. That's a way of achieving that. What are the opportunities through treaty of addressing Australia Day, of making it so that Victoria doesn't celebrate Australia Day, that we recognise it as the significant day that it is, but not as a day of celebration? Are there opportunities through treaty to instill action around climate and climate action? Because that's one of the key things for us as an Aboriginal community, from my perspective, is about sustainability, is about living in harmony with the environment. So how perhaps might we be able to leverage the treaty process to get action on climate and ensure that when we are being able to take back control of our lands and our waters, that there's actually lands and waters to be able to take care of. Other opportunities through treaty that might be as part of that framework is around having designated seats within Parliament, so ensuring there's a certain number of Aboriginal Victorians in our state Parliament, and through that, hopefully, actually having an Aboriginal person as the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. We've seen that happen now at the federal level, but can we see that cemented in ensuring that we have that as part of the Victorian model? But to me, a critical thing is that the treaty framework, what treaties are about, shouldn't necessarily be about specific projects or activities. It should be about embedding the authority within traditional owners to be able to make decisions for our people. Because if we can embed that authority, then whatever future decisions come along, we don't have to predict those. We can just say any decisions about this matter are going to be made by traditional owners. Those are the ones who will have the authority. And that's the opportunity provided through treaty. And that's one of the things that I'm hopeful that will ensure included in the framework. That's not a whole list. That's just some of the things that I think are really, really critical. Really keen to hear other people's thoughts about what other things should be in the framework. And I know that many of our other members of the Assembly have got other things they're really passionate about. I think that's what's great about the Assembly, that everyone brings with them the particular things that they've got a passion about, that they've got a knowledge about, and bring that to the table so we can get that holistic picture and make sure that as many things as possibly considered as part of this treaty negotiation process. One of the things really critical to recognise also, though, is that we've got a role as the Assembly to come up with our positions on these matters. We're then going to have to sit down with government and agree with them, because this needs to be an agreement we reach about what that framework looks like. So they're going to have to agree, we're going to have to come to an agreement around who we're treaties with, around what is part of a treaty, around which groups can have a treaty. That's going to be something we're going to have to sit down and negotiate and get agreement with government on. And so I think that's really important to be mindful of. It's not just about our community coming together and agreeing on it. It's about how can we get that agreed also with government. A few other things that I'd like to just touch on that have been kind of key issues that I've been thinking about and keen to hear people's perspectives. And this Facebook Live chat's not going to be the only way to get these perspectives. I'll continue to share posts and ask for questions and maybe start putting out some polls to ask for input as well. But one of the things that's percolating in my mind is trying to recognise and understand the difference between sovereignty and self-determination. And I think that's a really critical thing to understand. And the Act talks about sovereignty and it talks about self-determination. But when you look at something like the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that just talks about self-determination. So I think it's an important conversation we're going to need to have around what are the distinctions between sovereignty and self-determination? Is sovereignty something that's an individual right? Is it right that only sits with nations, with clans? Is it a right that can be given up? Where does self-determination sit in that? And to me, a lot of this is going to come down to what is it that we're trying to achieve and what's the mechanisms to make that happen. And what the name is might not be as important. It might be really important for some people, but I think for me, my particular focus is going to be on the outcomes. What's it going to mean for my kids? What's it going to mean for future generations? What are the outcomes going to be? Whether that's through sovereignty, whether that's through self-determination, what does that actually look like for how our future generations are living their lives? But really keen to hear what other people's thoughts are around the distinction between sovereignty and self-determination. Another thing that was raised to me through this process so far, and it was something highlighted by the things that have happened in Canada, was that the process of negotiating treaties and negotiating the framework for them was seen as just as important as the outcome. And so they were really keen to think about how can you embed cultural processes and protocols into the treaty process? How can we use the treaty process to rejuvenate cultural practices? How we can use the treaty process to bring nations together within the Aboriginal community. And so looking at the process as being just as important as the outcome and how we can embed that element of culture and rejuvenate culture is something I'm really mindful of, and also really quite keen to hear people's thoughts and perspectives about that. I'm also really mindful as well that it's quite clear within the legislation that the treaty process is not just about traditional owners. It is about Aboriginal Victorians. And so, to my understanding, that includes all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are living here in Victoria. So how can we have a treaty that is for traditional owners, but is also for all Aboriginal Victorians? And that's why I think that statewide treaty is going to be really critical in that. I think through this statewide treaty, that's where those benefits are going to be able to be achieved for traditional owners and also for Aboriginal Victorians. I've had some few questions that people have asked. I'm going to try and do my best to give some answers around those things. There were some questions posed beforehand, and I'm going to go through the stream and see what I can pick up from some questions over there. One of the questions that was raised was by Lydia Thorpe, and thanks to Lydia for her question, was around concerns she had around the sale of Crown land and around some logging that was happening and how that would impact on treaty. And I think that's a really important question. But I think it's really important to be mindful of what the role of the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria is. And from my perspective, I would rather see traditional owners lead in that area around what's going on with their lands at the moment. It's not our job as the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria to override the roles of traditional owners, to override the role of other peak bodies that might be out there around various fields, around justice, around land, around health and education. There are peak bodies out there around those things, and we're not there to override those. We've got a specific focus. And whilst I recognise that definitely, yes, if there is Crown land being sold, that's going to impact what's possible under treaty. But I'm also recognising that I'm entering this process with the spirit of trust and hopefully through this spirit of partnership with the government. And I know that there is a lot of scepticism and mistrust, and I think with good reason about what's happened in the past with our community and with government. But if you read through that preamble, I think there's some pretty powerful things in there. And if you listen to Daniel Andrews' speech that he gave to us at Parliament House, to me that gives me reason to have a bit of trust. And so I'm going to be entering into those negotiations under the understanding that the government is trying to do their best. And so that's the two elements to that. I encourage traditional owners to continue their role in looking after their lands and also enter into this with that spirit of trust. There was another question posted beforehand from Janine Coombs, and thanks to Janine, I believe she's still watching there, and she's been giving me some comments on the side as well. It was around confidentiality and how that works within our Constitution. And so there is within our Constitution a member's code of conduct, and that spells out issues around confidentiality, that if things have been identified as confidential, that they're not to be shared. That then causes a bit of a quandary because representatives from those groups are supposed to share things with their community, share things with their groups to be able to get feedback and get understanding. And so what we've been trying to ensure so far is that only things that are actually truly confidential are marked as confidential. So it's only things that for whatever reason we're not able to share at the moment would be kept confidential, but anything that we can share isn't marked as confidential, so those can be discussed, those can be shared. And you might recognise that the recent communique that came out from our board meeting, that's not confidential, so members are able to share that. And we plan to expand the information, the public information that's on our website, to give members a better understanding of what is public, what can they share, so that we can have these conversations, because it's really important that we don't just say, oh, sorry, I can't discuss that, it's confidential about all these matters. We need to be able to share these things. And I'm, from my perspective, I think we're hopefully going to be able to meet that balance of the things that we do need to keep confidential, whether that's for privacy reasons, whether that's part of our negotiating strategy and how we're working with government, that we do, but the things we need input from community, those can't be confidential. I mean, there's no point in needing input on key issues and having that confidential. We need to have that out there and in the open. I'm just going to have a look through now through the stream to see if there's any particular questions there that have not been addressed, and hopefully have addressed most of the things that people have mentioned on there. And if I do miss your comment, I apologise. Please, I'll try and get back or email those who I haven't been able to have a particular response to from the side. Just having a look through the side here. I recognise that some people have highlighted that there are concerns that the traditional owner corporations are not working properly, and there are mechanisms to try and address that. You can go, they are under ORIC, and ORIC has ways of addressing concerns that people have. And so again, I think from my perspective, if things aren't, I don't want to start from scratch on things. If there are existing mechanisms that we can strengthen, that we can fix to help them do the things that we're going to need to do, that would be where I would think we should focus on first. We've got Damien Bell there's raised the issue around direct land tax contributions to traditional owners, and yes, that's definitely a really powerful one, and one I've heard a lot of. How can we ensure financial sustainability for our traditional owner organisations, and through some sort of land tax? That's definitely a way that would be able to do that. So I think, again, we've had some questions there around, and thanks Gary Murray for raising the question around the difference between sovereignty and self-determination. And I think in terms of the legal standing, we're going to need to get a really good understanding of what that means. And we have seen in other countries that states, the government was not prepared to give up sovereignty. They were prepared to give up self-determination, but not sovereignty. And so what would that mean for us here in Victoria? It's not my understanding there is a firm position from the Victorian government on this yet. And so it's going to be a conversation we need to keep having. But also the conversation I mentioned before is, what does it actually mean to our community, the difference between sovereignty and self-determination, and how can we go about getting outcomes that we want, and from my perspective, not just being solely stuck on one word or not and saying, well, it's a failure if we don't have sovereignty. That's not to say we don't strive for sovereignty, but I think any suggestion that a treaty process is a failed process if we don't have sovereignty within that, I have reservations around that perspective. I think it's about the outcomes that are more important. So thank you so much for all those who joined in. Really, really appreciate people tuning in. I plan to leave this video up so people can share it. If you do have particular questions, please, my Facebook is a way to get in touch with me. You can also use my email address, which is available from the First Peoples website. Really hope you do keep getting engaged, keep asking questions. I don't have all the answers to your questions, and I'm not always going to share your view on things as well, and that's fine. But please keep sharing your views. Please keep sharing your questions. I'll try and get back to you as much as I can, and I'll try and keep sharing what we're doing at the Assembly, keep sharing what we're doing as committees, keep sharing what we're doing as a board, and get as much information out there. I encourage you to keep engaged in other ways. It is hard through this whole COVID-19 situation. We can't be out there in person. But I really encourage you to, if you're not already signed up, sign up to the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria Facebook page. They're about to start a campaign of much more information coming out about specific streams, many of which I've spoken about. And there is still opportunities to enrol to vote. So I mentioned there is going to be more elections at the end of our term. Enrol to vote. Get on the roll so that you can be a part of this process. So if you don't like what we're doing now as the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, get on the roll, enrol and vote, and get the people you want on there. Really encourage people to be involved, and thank you so much to all those people who have joined me here. It was an experiment. Hopefully it worked okay, and hopefully I've learned a few things from the process about how to do this better. I'm still getting the hang of trying to respond to all the various comments, so I apologise if I didn't get onto your comment in particular. But I'll just finish off by saying thank you all very much for joining me here as part of this live stream. And take care and stay safe. Well, look.